Hello guys, welcome back. I'm Eloise. I hope everyone's doing good. So I feel like I've been talking a lot about some designer houses lately, like Dior and Chanel and Guerlain. Today we're going to talk about something a little different. I'm a really big fan of Papillon Artisan Perfumery fragrances, which is basically a niche sort of indie perfume house out of London, and the creator and the nose behind all the fragrances is a perfumer by the name of Liz Moores. And I believe that Liz Moores is a self-taught perfumer. And the first fragrance that Liz Moores created was in 2012, and it's called Anubis. And from what I read, what turned out to be Anubis was a fragrance that she created for herself. And when she ended up with the final product, she realized that the fragrance was inspired by ancient Egypt, and the fragrance was named Anubis. And I have a full bottle of Anubis. I tested this out for a bit before I actually went for the full bottle, and it's an absolutely stunning fragrance in my opinion. I really enjoy wearing this. So the name Anubis was inspired by the Egyptian god of afterlife, and the fragrance itself is meant to embody something sacred and mysterious that's connected to ancient Egypt. And the fragrance to me wears like a sort of dark, leathery, smoky fragrance that has incense running through it, and it's balsamic. I think it has some warmth from like myrrh. I think there's myrrh in here as well. And behind this leathery, smoky, sort of balsamic, dark, rich fragrance, you have this jasmine that sort of peeks through. I don't get too much of the floral in here, but there is the sparkle of the jasmine behind this sort of smoky, leathery fragrance that comes off almost brown and syrupy. If I had to sort of put a vision to this, what this smells like, I'm thinking something balsamic and sort of syrupy brown that's warm and smoky. And the leathery aspects of this are sort of dark, but not anything animalic to my nose. I don't find this challenging or animalic to wear, although I think some other reviewers have mentioned Anubis being difficult to wear. I personally don't think there's anything difficult about wearing this fragrance. It's not an animalic leather. It's not a barnyardy leather. It's not a birch tar leather. It's a leather that's almost suede-like in texture. And the way the fragrance is composed, it comes together with the smokiness that's almost tobacco-like to my nose. There's almost a little bit of smokiness where you think you're smelling some aspects of tobacco, at least to my nose. And I think that tobacco-y aspect might be coming from the immortelle in here. So if you look at the official website, it describes the scent profile in the notes, and it's described as blooms of jasmine that are smoldered over a base of frankincense and labdanum and sandalwood. And then you have this description that the fragrance has like vivid notes that sort of contrast, and those vivid notes are immortelle and pink lotus and saffron in here. So you have a little bit of the spiciness from the saffron that can also be contributing perhaps to the sort of leathery suede-like texture. But overall, I think that this is a really enjoyable, rich, leathery fragrance. Some might think that it's a little masculine leaning. I have no problem wearing this. I really enjoy this fragrance, actually. I like it a lot. It's a smoky, leathery, rich fragrance that lasts on my skin all day. And I have here pre-blotted sample strips. This is the one for Anubis. It's so deep and rich. Really good. It's a great fragrance. And the other fragrances, the other four that we'll talk about, have already been pre-blotted on these tester strips, because what I have are these dabber samples, and it's just annoying to sort of do this on camera. So they're pre-blotted, and I've worn all of these on skin. I've been wearing them on skin for the past 2 months. So I really wanted to talk about these fragrances from a place of experience rather than just dabbing on camera for the first time. I don't have full bottles, but I will have at least one of the ones that we're going to talk about. So let's talk about Dryad next. We're going to talk about Dryad and Salome because they're two cheaper fragrances, but they're really quite different. And I want to talk about the differences because I've been testing both out and sort of deciding which one I would go for a full bottle of. And I think I know now. So Dryad is a 2017 release by the House of Papillon, and this one is a bright chypre, very vintage-like, very reminiscent of the chypre fragrances of yesteryear. It's really a classic vintage style proper chypre in my opinion. This opens up really sharp and bright, can almost be a little bit off-putting, but I feel like just after a few minutes, you start to get those florals that come through, and I think there's like a peach note, and there's a lot of green to the fragrance. So I would say, and I think it's described as a green chypre fragrance, and it has so much depth, and it maintains a brightness from the citrus elements, and it has a lot of green to it as well, all the way to the dry down. So think a version of Mitsuko, think along those lines. While Salome, which we'll talk about next, is a chypre, but in a different category. It's a darker chypre. If I had to describe how it's different from this one, I would say that it's a darker chypre. This one is a brighter, uplifting chypre. And there's a prominent galbanum note in here. And galbanum could be a little bitter, and it could be a little like forest-like and really herbaceous. And I think it provides a lot of the green aspects to the fragrance. And when the florals start to come through, I almost pick up something that comes off like Immortelle to my nose. I made some notes and I wrote Immortelle ? I don't see Immortelle listed as a note, but there's something in here that made me wonder if Immortelle is part of this composition. Sort of that green, hay-like, almost in the territory of that honey, but very specific to the note of Immortelle. If you recognize it, it's sort of very unique in fragrances. And I feel like I'm picking up on something in here that's reminding me just a little bit, like an aspect that would come from an Immortelle note. But the florals are accompanied by something of in like incense to my nose, and it's just really, really smooth, and it's a really nice composition. And I feel like the notes are sort of coming at you as you smell the fragrance. Parts of the notes come at you. So you get a little bit of the florals that sort of have like an incensey sort of vibe, and the citrus aspects peek through. They're not as bright and sharp as in the opening, and it's really green and mossy, and it really is a vintage style chypre fragrance. And I feel like there's a powderiness to the florals in here, and it's a complex fragrance. Every time I put my nose to the test strip or to my arm when I was testing this, I get a different aspect of this fragrance. I think it's really well done. It's complex, it has a lot of layers to it, and in the dry down you get some of the woody notes. But like I said, it's really a vintage style proper chypre, and I really enjoy this one. And this brings me to the next one, which is Salome. Salome is a 2015 release. So Salome was released before Dryad, so I should have spoken about Salome before Dryad, I guess. But I'm a big fan of Salome. You have to like the animalic aspects of Salome to appreciate this fragrance. If you don't like animalic notes in fragrances, particularly a cumin note, cumin is prominent, especially in the opening of Salome, then you probably would prefer something like Dryad, which stays away from the animalic sort of aspects that Salome has in the fragrance. So this one is also considered a chypre fragrance, but there's so much more to it. It's like the dark counterpart of Dryad, and it might be a little more challenging to wear for anyone who doesn't like cumin. The fragrance opens up animalic, but on my skin, I feel like as it dries down, those animalic notes in the opening and that prominent cumin note, I feel like they subside. Then the fragrance gives way to the florals, and you have green aspects together with the florals that come through. Really, really nice. And there's something smoky about the fragrance as well, but there's a lot of green that comes behind the floral components in here. And the leatheriness, the texture, that leatheriness that accompanies the rest of this composition, it's absolutely stunning. I think this is a stunning chypre fragrance. I really like this one a lot. So I was considering Dryad, and I was comparing it to Salome. And not that I can't have both, but I have chypre fragrances that are in the realm of Dryad that sort of have that more uplifting, it stays in a more uplifting sort of chypre category, in my opinion. Salome is a little different. It's a little more interesting. It's a little sexy. In fact, a lot of the reviews on Salome talk about how there's like a sexy skankiness to this, and there's sort of the idea of sex behind this fragrance. I'm not sure that I would go that far, but it does have animalic components. It is, I guess, sort of a little bit like skanky sexy, but overall, this is a great chypre fragrance that has smoky, leathery touches, floral, little green, and I really enjoy it. It does hold on to a little bit of an animalic component as it dries down. I'm not saying that it loses all of it, but I think the way it opens up is much more animalic than the way it is as it dries down. So it's a great green, leathery chypre fragrance. So that's Salome in summary to my nose. While Dryad, I wrote down, is brighter, it's more floral, there's a little bit of sweetness. It's also balsamic, and it's green and mossy as well. But Salome, although it's also balsamic, it's just darker. It's darker, and it's the sexier version of a chypre fragrance in the house of Papillon, in my opinion. That's how I would categorize these two fragrances. So I think Salome is going to be a full bottle for me. I think it's a fantastic fragrance. So next, let's talk about another one that I'm really liking, and this is Spell 125, Spell 125. It's a 2021 release, and this fragrance I found really interesting. It changes from the opening to the dry down, to the mid and the dry down. There are changes here. It's so good. It opens really incensey and piney. It's like being in a forest with pine trees and other green, mossy green trees. And so it's green and incensey. It's like you're walking through a forest burning incense. And some people describe this as being in like an old temple. I've heard some reviews, the incense that's burning in like a temple. That's not what it brings me to, but it's really green for sure and incensey. But it does change as it dries down. It gets very interesting. That piney opening subsides a little bit. It remains green and incensey, but the strong piney opening starts to subside as the fragrance dries down. And that's where it reminds me, maybe a distant cousin to Dior's discontinued Leather Oud. So I think maybe it's the woody aspects of this fragrance with the texture that's almost coming off like leathery to my nose. I think it's those aspects of this fragrance together with the incense that reminds me of leather oud with the leather slash woody components of that fragrance. There's something about this. So imagine leather oud with pine needles sprinkled all over it. That's what this reminds me of. This dries down into something resinous and balsamic and woody. The woody aspects come through, to my nose at least. And so you have this really nice, like, there's that syrupy component that I feel like you get in myrrh. I'm not sure if there's myrrh in here, but there's something balsamic in the dry down and maybe resinous as well that's giving me a little bit of like a leathery texture. And there's something just slightly animalic that I pick up, just a slight nuance, nothing that overtakes the fragrance, but there's definitely a balsamic element that comes through together with woody notes, with that green, and the pine is sort of subsides a bit. It's not as strong. So it is still green and incensey, but I love how the balsamic elements and the woody aspects come through. And it reminds me of a green version of leather oud from Dior, which, by the way, I ended up hunting down and getting a bottle, even though it's discontinued. I got a decant from Eugene from You Smells Good, and I tested it out a whole bunch, and I fell in love with it. And I searched for a bottle, I found one, and there's one on the way, and so I can't wait to receive that. But this one does remind me of that, but with a green element to it. So that's Spell 125. So now let's talk about Hera, which is a 2022 release. This fragrance was created by Liz Moores for her daughter to wear on her wedding day. And this is a really beautiful floral fragrance that I was testing out with the idea of maybe turning into a full bottle. And I'm not sure that this is turning into a full bottle for me, but it is, objectively speaking, a beautiful, beautiful fragrance. It has this really beautiful heart. In my opinion, at the heart of it is this beautiful orris that's powdery. And a lot of people, in talking about this fragrance, described it as going in a soapy direction, which I don't really get. I get a very round, buttery iris, and accompanying this buttery iris are these florals that are also a little indolic and a little green. And it could be from the narcissus in here that might be taking the white florals. There's jasmine, there's orange blossom, there's ylang in here, there's rose de mai. It could be bringing the white florals into sort of the green territory, because there's a lot of green, to my nose, that comes along with the white florals. So it's contrasting. It's not your typical white floral fragrance. There's more to it. I think there's something a little musky in here. I'm not sure if there's ambrette, but I'm really sensitive to ambrette in fragrances. I said this in another video. I was really not a fan of ambrette, and I almost sold my bottle of Diptyque's Fleur de Peau, which is ambrette heavy. And actually Dior Homme Parfum has the ambrette, and I thought that maybe that's what was putting me off. But I think that I've sort of grown to love fragrances with ambrette, or at least I should say, although it bothered me at one point, I think maybe my taste has changed and I don't mind it, or I like it. It's not something that's putting me off in fragrances anymore. But I think here it's musky, and there's something slightly, ever so slightly animalic. I don't know if it's coming from the narcissus. There's something ever so slightly animalic and very natural sort of smelling in this fragrance. I can't quite put my finger on it. And it's very old world, like vintage floral, which I can really appreciate. I like vintage fragrances. I like fragrances like the chypres that bring you back to vintage style chypre fragrances. I like that. And this one is a delicate one. I can see how this is really ethereal and beautiful for someone's wedding day. It's really fitting. It's a beautiful fragrance. It really is. So that's Hera. It's really pretty, very nice fragrance. So I also want to mention a few other fragrances that I don't have samples of, but that I've gotten my nose on. Angelique, which my sister has a bottle of, and I sprayed it on myself once, I think, and was thinking that I would love it because I love iris, and it's an iris fragrance. But I found that it was very fleeting, so I never really got a sample. So I can't really give a full in-depth sort of opinion or review on Angelique. I just remember that because I like iris fragrances, I was excited to try it and found that it was fleeting and too light wearing. So I sort of never followed up. I never got a decant, but I will get a decant of that one and maybe test it out because I am a big fan of iris fragrances, and I should probably try it before I write it off. So Angelique was released in 2013, and I remember that it was like a powdery iris, very, very delicate fragrance, even more subdued than Hera, actually. So I'll have to try that one out again. And then finally, I'll end the video by touching on Tobacco Rose, which is a 2012 release from Papillon. And I owned a bottle of that one, and I gave it to my sister because I have so many rose fragrances, and I actually decluttered a few rose fragrances from my collection. So I was never really a big fan of rose fragrances, but some combinations like the rose oud or the rose patchouli, which have been so popular. I think the rose oud was so played out that people might be sick of it at this point. But the rose patchouli combination, I've had a few of those, and I still have in my collection Diptyque's Eau Capitale, which I enjoy. And then I had Mendito Rosa's Le Mat, and I ended up decluttering that one because I was testing out Les Indemodables Rose de Jamal, and just recently, and I love that fragrance. And I was also testing Les Abstraits La Dolaire Exquise, and I was really close to getting a full bottle finally of Rose de Jamal, and I wore La Dolaire Exquise, and I ordered a bottle the next morning. It's on the way. I am in love with that fragrance, in love. I wore it to work, and my coworker, who knows that I'm always wearing something new, and she's always curious to sort of see what I'm smelling like on any given day, she said she smelled me from around the corner. So I'm not sure if that's a good thing, but I so enjoyed wearing that fragrance. And that's why it's so important to test fragrances and really have full wears, like where you can spray it on yourself and have it throughout the day, see how it performs, see what you're getting from it, see what it makes you feel like. I really enjoyed that fragrance, and I ended up decluttering Le Mat by Mendito Rosa, which is a rose patchouli fragrance, because as beautiful as that fragrance is, it's a little sharp, and I found La Dolaire Exquise to be really, really smooth. And I found that I was really, really enjoying the beautiful iris component to it. I think it is a beautiful note in that fragrance and works so well. And I just fell in love, and I ordered a full bottle of that one. So I decluttered some rose fragrances in my collection, and I decluttered Papillon's Tobacco Rose. So Tobacco Rose is basically what the name implies, a rose tobacco fragrance that doesn't actually have tobacco in it. It's the notes in the fragrance that create the tobacco accord. And as beautiful as the fragrance is, there's nothing wrong with the fragrance itself. It's not that I didn't like it. I found it to be too much about the rose. It was predominantly rose, and even though I got the nuances of the other notes in the fragrance, including the smokiness from the tobacco to contrast the rose, I felt that it was, to my nose, that it was 90% rose, and maybe it's just not the kind of fragrance that I am really into. I guess I like more like Portrait of a Lady or La Dolaire Exquise that has a predominant rose to the fragrance, but that has a lot more going on, basically. So Tobacco Rose is a beautiful fragrance for those of you that really appreciate rose and fragrances. It's really well done. I think it has a lot of fans, and it has a really nice tobacco sort of smoky contrast to the rose. And the rose is really well done. So that's my take on these fragrances from this beautiful perfume house that, if it doesn't get a lot of love, I think should get more love. But I do think that it does in the fragrance community. I do think that a lot of people love the fragrances that Liz Moores creates. I like vintage style fragrances. And I think some of these, like Anubis and Dryad and Salome, they are absolute masterpieces of fragrances. And it's hard to find, I think. It's hard to find fragrances like this. People like the sweetness, and a lot of the fragrances that come out these days, I feel, not to generalize, but I feel like a lot of them, even by some of these great houses that I really do like, a lot of them have like this synthetic, overly sweet sort of feel and scent profile. So I appreciate fragrances like Salome and Dryad. I mean, I think they're beautiful. And Anubis, which is absolutely stunning. So let me know if you guys have gotten your nose on any of these by Papillon Artisan Perfumery, what you guys think of this house, and what you think about the fragrances that we spoke about in today's video. As always, thank you so much for watching, your support, and your comments. And until next time, bye guys.